Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. Well, have you watched this most recent piece of genocidal apologetics that just came out by Dr. Phil earlier this week? It's already got about 1 million views on it. I just had to respond to it, at least in part. So that's what this is. Let's get into it. All right, everybody. So I just watched this garbage interview between Dr. Phil and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. It's about an hour long, 50 minutes thereabouts, and it's absolutely horrible. I mean, it's exhausting. There's so many things. There's just so many falsehoods. It's just mind-numbing. Virtually everything, certainly within the introduction, and even throughout the body of it, is just falsehood after falsehood after falsehood after falsehood. I would, in fact, like to do point-by-point deconstruction of this video, perhaps in a live, but I mean, it would take me about 2 to 3 hours, I would say at the minimum. I'm going to address the first few points. Dr. Phil opens this interview with just about the most canned, rehearsed Western agitprop that we've been hearing for the past 7 months. There's nothing new here. He refers to October 7th as a direct attack upon the Jews, the greatest attack upon the Jews since the Holocaust. And this is perhaps the most insidious part of Israeli propaganda and Western propaganda as a whole. First of all, this conflation of Israel or Zionism with Judaism or international Jewry overall. It's complete nonsense. Let me ask you, what state on the planet gets away with drawing arbitrary borders on a map, saying this belongs to nation X, Israel in this case, and everybody who belongs within this border as a citizen is defined by a particular religious or racial character? We have a name for things like that. We call it ethnostatism and theocracy. It's precisely what Germany was trying to do under the Nazi regime, defining Germany not as Germans, no. I mean, if you want to call anybody who lives within Israel as a citizen Israelis, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when you do what the Germans did and you start defining Germany in terms of Aryans, white Christians. What about when the far right in the United States or anywhere in Western lands defines itself as a Christian nation? Humanity has been vociferous in condemning that sort of thing. And yet Israel gets away with it time and time and time again, to the point where to say Jew or to say Israel, they've become synonymous. There's nothing synonymous about Israel and Jewry. There's nothing synonymous about Judaism, Jewry, and Zionism. Zionism is an ideology you can convert into and apostatize out of. It has nothing to do with ethnicity or ancestry. That's about as close to authoritarianism as you can get when a government seeks to insulate itself from perfectly legitimate questions and objections and criticism, or to make it a point of victimization on behalf of a marginalized group. And so don't let people get away with that when they pull that nonsense. He also mentions how Hamas is less than hospitable to its hostages. And I'm not going to disprove that statement today, but I'm just going to say, well, Israel purports to be the most open democratic society in the Middle East, one of the most open societies in the world, in fact. Let's compare it to the people who claim to be the standard. How does Israel treat its hostages? Well, they call them prisoners to legitimize it, but how do they treat the children that are under administrative detention, who get electrocuted in their genitals and interrogated, which makes Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay look like student films? You want to purport yourself as the standard? I say let's compare notes to how Hamas is handling their hostages and Israel's handling its hostages. I'm not saying Hamas handles their hostages well. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you're purporting to be the standard here. Let's compare notes. Dr. Phil introduces this by calling it the Israel-Hamas war. It's not a war on Hamas. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time on that in this video. Dr. Phil says that Israel gave up the Gaza Strip in goodwill back in 2005. It wasn't a goodwill gesture. It came out of the collapse of the Camp David negotiations in 2000 and its subsequent Second Intifada. Dr. Phil refers to the student encampments on universities, mainly in the United States, although worldwide now, pressuring universities to divest from the genocidal apartheid occupational state that is Israel. And he refers to these students as terrorist sympathizers. If they were terrorist sympathizers, they would be supporting Israel, my friend. And this is actually perhaps one of the most important points that I want to make from my end of the argument, and it's this. It is possible, and in fact most on the pro-Palestine side, does distinguish between supporting Hamas, which is dubious because there's many things about Hamas that are objectionable, both in terms of governance and even in their methods of violence. But it is possible to distinguish between what Hamas does, but at the same time defend Palestinian resistance against an occupational force that is illegal. Illegal not by Western standards, but by the highest legal authority that exists on the planet. Our defense of Palestinians, our defense of the civilian population of Gazans, our defense of justified resistance against an occupational, colonizing apartheidist state is not, therefore, support for Hamas and their intolerant views. So I've debunked a couple of the introductory remarks, and some I've just left that I can't get around to all of these. It would take me an hour just to debunk literally everything he says within the first minute and a half, because it's just verbal diarrhea. It just comes at you, falsehood after falsehood after falsehood. There was something really interesting, and I think this is probably the centerfold, at least for me. Watch this clip right here.
Prime Minister, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. Welcome to Israel.
Nah, it's Palestine. Sorry, bro. That wasn't it. I couldn't help myself. Here it is.
I have a question. Are the Palestinian people at large complicit in this? How do you tell the difference between Hamas and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? Because Hamas doesn't wear a uniform. They hide among the civilians. They hide in schools. They hide in churches. They wear civilian clothes, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention. Are Palestinians complicit in this, or are they just hiding among them?
Invoking the Geneva Conventions? Really, Dr. Phil? Really, Benjamin Netanyahu? Israel repeatedly dismisses and flouts international law, the Geneva Convention specifically. Did you know that? In the United Nations, Israel doesn't hold itself accountable or amenable to the Geneva Conventions at all. It does hold itself somewhat responsible, on the most convenient points at least, to occupation law. But it rejects the Geneva Conventions, except of course when it's convenient for them. And the Geneva Convention specifically says about state actors, not non-state actors, about state actors, Israel fitting that bill perfectly, that whether they agree with it or not, they're still answerable to the Geneva Conventions. So there is no off-ramp for Israel just because they have some trifles with the document. I want you to listen to something very carefully, because this is where Dr. Phil and Mr. Netanyahu undermine and debunk themselves. Listen to this.
When we talk about Hamas, we're clearly talking about a terror group. This is not a government, it's a militia, a terrorist group.
I haven't said it. They said it. Hamas is not a government. It's a militia. Now that's very important when it comes into the Geneva Conventions, and I'm speaking as someone who's actually read the Geneva Conventions. Now, in a minute, you're going to see how that completely undermines whatever they say going forward, especially in reference to international law. He doesn't say the R2P doctrine officially, but he does mention war crimes, which is part of the R2P doctrine. Here's what you have to understand about the Gaza Strip and Hamas. First of all, let's start with the Gaza Strip. Gazans live under siege, perpetual siege, for the better part of 2 decades, actually. So back in 2007, after Hamas won the election, what happened? Israel put up a siege. It was a land blockade, it's a naval blockade, and it's an aerial blockade. No thing goes into Gaza without Israel's express consent. No thing leaves Gaza without Israel's express consent. No body goes into Gaza without Israel's consent. No body leaves Gaza without Israel's express consent. Yes, even along the Rafah-Egypt border. There is no government in Gaza. Hamas fills some administrative role, and Israel controls everything else. There is no autonomy to speak of. And I'm not saying it. Dr. Phil is saying it. They're not a government. Okay. Well, now here's the thing. Within the Geneva Convention itself, it has certain tolerances and ambiguities for very difficult, complicated urban combat. You have to understand about Gaza, this is prior to October 7th, the population density of Gaza was about that of Tokyo, a little worse actually. It's much worse now, where you've got 1.5 million people tenting, living in tent cities in Rafah. So it's gotten much, much worse since October 7th. In fact, it's gone from being a concentration camp by definition to being a death camp by definition. And it's not my definitions. You go to any dictionary and it fits the qualifications perfectly. Gaza is a concentration camp. So said David Cameron himself back in 2010, and many, many other sources. Incidentally, some of our most respected human rights organizations on the planet, who are no longer allowed in there, by the way. But prior to October 7th, you had the highest population density pretty much in the entire world, with a few spare exceptions. And it's on a par with Tokyo. Now it's much, much worse. But at least Tokyo has civilian infrastructure to service that population. Back in 2014, fully 10 years ago, Israel obliterated most of the civilian infrastructure under its psychotic protective edge operation. Let's come back to this point about Hamas not being a government. I didn't say it, Dr. Phil said it. Application of the Genocide Convention to irregular forces, to non-state actors or guerrilla units, which is what Hamas is. Applications of the Geneva Convention to Hamas are irrelevant at best and ambiguous at the very worst. Within the Geneva Convention itself, it has tolerances built in for, the use of uniforms, for example. These militias being what they are, they're not able to clearly mark themselves out. And again, this isn't an endorsement for Hamas. It's another thing about the Geneva Conventions. Just because certain war crimes have been committed on one side does not give the other side carte blanche to break with the Geneva Convention. There is no off-ramp in the Geneva Convention or any of international law. Israel repeatedly wants to take all of these bypasses out of responsibility when it's convenient for them, but it says specifically in the Geneva Convention that for actual states, we're talking about governments, which he just said Hamas doesn't qualify as such. There is no exception. It applies whether you accept the authority of the Geneva Convention or not. Now that's within the legislation itself, many times in the international court and international bodies. They reject out of hand, and we can thank Nelson Mandela for this, by the way, they reject out of hand any application of international law to militia groups because of the nature of their combat. It is not possible to conduct yourself as a proper autonomous state military. So that exemption stands outside of the Geneva Conventions, and it's even written into the Geneva Conventions. So the invocation of international law on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu here is bullshit. Incidentally, Hamas does open itself to investigation if Israel would reciprocate. They have said that they're open to investigations of war crimes that have potentially been committed. If Israel will sign on to the same, of course, Israel won't. So there's that as well. I want you to identify the propaganda here, because even calling it the Israel-Hamas war is absolutely idiotic. Think about this. Think about if we had called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a war between Germany and the Jewish militias in that concentration camp. Most specifically, I'm talking about the ZOB and the ZZW. That is the right-wing group that was called the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union. These guys were operating within the Warsaw Ghetto. Would the history books report that as the German ZOB or ZZW war? That is preposterous. And yet in the West, that's what the media has to call it. They're not going to call it what it is, which is a full-on genocide and campaign of ethnic cleansing. Can you imagine our history books referring to the uprising of the sugar planters, say, in St. Domingue in Cuba, as a war? Could you imagine referring to the Nor'westers or the Bois Brûlés resistance as a war? Could you imagine the Nat Turner Rebellion being referred to as a war? Could you imagine Nelson Mandela's Umkhonto we Sizwe being referred to as a war? Could you imagine the Rwanda Patriotic Front, headed by Paul Kagame, as a war when they were resisting a genocide of the Tutsis and the Twa? Yet again, Israel gets away with it every single day. There's absolutely no symmetry in this conflict between the two. It is a war against a defenseless civilian population, and that's that, full stop. And building on that idea, look at what Benjamin Netanyahu has to say about human shielding.
They use them as human shields, and they target civilians, and they hide behind their civilians, their own civilians. They target ours, hide behind theirs. That is a double war crime. And of course, this makes Israel's task so much more difficult.
A double war crime, hey? Well, I'm glad you admit it, because I've already explained how human shielding in this case doesn't apply to a militia, given the complexities of their combat, being in the densest urban population imaginable. In fact, you, as a state sponsor of your military, moving into that civilian population, that qualifies as human shielding. The UN doesn't recognize Israeli right to self-defense, not in the context of their occupation and Palestinian resistance. In the context of Palestinian resistance, Israel has no rights. But in that last clip that you saw, you actually see Benjamin Netanyahu condemn what his own military is doing. He himself calls it a double war crime. Dr. Phil himself, with Netanyahu's approval, says Hamas is not a government. Hamas is a militia. I want to read something specifically from the Geneva Convention here in a moment, but especially in the context of what Netanyahu says there about Palestinian complicity in the quote-unquote support of Hamas, or in his claim that Hamas both targets Israeli civilians and hides behind its own civilians in human shielding. Listen to this. This is Article 50, subsection 3 in the Geneva Conventions. It says, the presence within the civilian population of individuals who do not come within the definition of civilians does not deprive the population of its civilian character. This is what you get when you actually read international law and not quote it as if you know anything about international law. But I want to circle back to that point there about Hamas having some genocidal intent against Israel. That's not altogether wrong. But again, in context, Israel is the occupational force. According to the Dalit Plan and many, many other documents, including the Likud Party's constitution, has open statements of genocide that it, at the same time, condemns in the Hamas constitution, which the Hamas constitution, they have never resorted to it in modern applications. But let's grant that it's a genocidal document. I'll concede that much in a heartbeat. It's probably the only thing that the three of us agree on, that is Benjamin Netanyahu, Dr. Phil, and I. But since then, Hamas, just like the PLO before them, has recognized Israel's existence on the land, referring to the pre-1967 lines, that is, and has endorsed Resolution 242, which was, if you're familiar, it was the precursor to the Oslo Accords. Palestinian authorities had to recognize that Israel has a legitimate existence on this land. Again, none of this is a moral endorsement of Hamas. It's just setting the facts straight. Now let me ask you, why should Hamas, or even if you want to apply collective guilt, which Israel does, to Palestinians, why would Palestinians acknowledge Israel's existence? That is to say, why would Palestinians continue to respect and recognize Israel's existence when Israel isn't willing to reciprocate? Would you? So that's the context that you get this intent, is a reaction to the genocidal intent of Israel, who actually does have the guns and the muscle to operate an ethnic cleansing, has effected an ethnic cleansing and genocide in the past. This is why we refer to it as the ongoing Nakba, not the Nakba of 1948. It continues to this very day. Now, I have supported my claims with the Geneva Convention, and I would stand by it, but you don't have to take my word for it if you need a source. I review books on this channel, and I would highly recommend, actually, that you watch a particular book review I did of Nora Eirkat's book called justice for some. And literally everything I've mentioned in this video, especially when concerning international law, is substantiated within that book with actual direct references. I would just suggest that you read either that book or you read the Geneva Conventions and the R2P doctrine. It might take you a couple days to get through all of it, but then you would actually be in the know. Now, there's a million things that I could take issue with in this video. It was literally just about the worst, most hateful, genocidal piece of propaganda I think I've seen in a long time. And this would be hours long if I were to go through point by point by point, which I'm willing to do, by the way. If you want to see that, maybe tell me in the comments if you would like to see a deconstruction of this interview. I think it was an important interview. It was very high profile. Sadly, whether we like it or not, it'll be recorded in the annals of history. So it's important that we know what was said. But in conclusion, I would like to share something with you. I recorded this because it was such a beautiful quote, but sadly, I couldn't source who it was. I can't even remember which book I read it out of, to be honest. So this will have to remain uncredited. Listen to this. I dedicate this to the people of Gaza and Palestinians broadly. Gaza may force us to glimpse into the heart of darkness, but it equally reveals the heart of humanity that never gives up. Gaza is not a footnote. It is the larger-than-life shadow of the colonizers' fear, a people that cannot be quelled. Gaza is larger than life, captivating, awesome, mesmerizing, extraordinary, impressive, monumental, unreal, burdensome, miraculous, and most of all, durable. To the people of Gaza, especially those who have had to listen to the twaddle of Dr. Phil and Benjamin Netanyahu, I want you to hear that we see you. We are not content to just sit and eulogize your genocide. We're fighting like hell for your emancipation. And to the student encampments as well, you are true blue heroes. History will immortalize what you're doing. Don't forget it. Free, free Palestine. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.